On today's Emerging Tech Horizons, doing MOSA really shouldn't be that hard. Why DoD can't get it right and how it can do it better. Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about the Modular Open Systems Approach, or MOSA. MOSA is an engineering and acquisition approach to use modular designs and standard interfaces and systems to create better interoperability and potentially upgradability. Additionally, in theory, MOSA reduces the overall lifetime lifecycle cost for a DoD weapon system due to the greater availability of compatible upgrade parts. It's become one of the standard go-to answers in every how to improve acquisition conversation. The expert says, well, we should make more use of MOSA. And so today we're here to talk about DoD's efforts to actually make more use of MOSA and all of the benefits and maybe some of the disadvantages of using these open and modular systems. To help us understand all of this is our great guest, Anne McDonough. Anne is an assistant director at the Government Accountability Office, GAO, where she's focused on contracting and national security acquisition issues. She is the lead for a recent report by GAO entitled Weapon Systems Acquisition. DoD needs better planning to attain benefits of modular open systems, a classic GAO-style title. Anne has been at GAO for 20 years and has worked on a variety of defense acquisition issues. She's also done some work on Capitol Hill and even field work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Anne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Arun. Happy to be here.
So first, I want to ask you about your background. How'd you get to GAO? What kind of things do you do there?
Yeah, so I've been at GAO for about 20 years now, and there's a lot of different paths people take to get to GAO. I actually studied business as an undergraduate at GW. Then I went into marketing strategy consulting out in San Francisco. I moved there right at the end of the dot-com bust, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed the intellectual challenge of consulting, figuring out what was the problem and what were actionable solutions. But I wanted to move from the consumer product side to something that was more of a public policy focus. So I went to graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley. I focused on public policy. I was actually an intern at GAO in 2004, and then I've been there since 2005.
And then your work at GAO, you've been focused on acquisition. You're part of a group called Contracting and National Security Acquisitions. We've actually had your boss, Shelby Oakley, as a guest on the podcast before. What does that group, CNSA, do?
Yeah, so as your guests probably know, GAO is Congress's watchdog. So we look across the realm of federal spending, and we do that through 15 different mission teams. So Contracting and National Security Acquisition, or CNSA, is one of those. We look at government-wide contracting, and then we also look at major systems acquisitions at DoD, DHS, and NASA. And within the DoD acquisition environment, we're really Congress's eyes and ears on what's going on. And we do three major types of work there. We do drill downs where we look in depth at what's happening on a specific program. And those tend to be the bigger programs like the Columbia-class submarine or the F-35. We do our annual weapons systems assessment that every year we look at the portfolio of DoD's most expensive systems. And I think that's what Shelby was here to talk about. And then we also try to be forward-looking and work on leading practices. So there we're looking at what are innovative commercial companies doing and how can we apply that to DoD.
So before we get into the report, I was really curious. You actually did go to the field. You went to Iraq, you went to Afghanistan. What does GAO do in places like that?
Yeah, and in those cases, there, as you can imagine, there's a lot of money being spent. So, and it's being spent quickly. So it was important for GAO to be on the ground there. And what we had small offices of 3 people, and we would do a lot of the field work for our teams that were doing audits. So we'd have we lived at the embassy and had just sort of constant interaction on what was happening with state, USAID, and DoD there.
That's great. So today we're going to talk about the Modular Open Systems effort. Why'd you take on this job?
So your listeners might know, but GAO gets its work in 3 primary ways. We'll get requests from members or committees, mandates from the law or committee reports, or sometimes in rare cases, we'll do work on our own accord. In this particular case, we had mandates from both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees to look at MOSA. In the NDAA for 2016, there was a lot of legislation about MOSA, and that continued in later years. And so by this point, the committees wanted to know, basically, is this working? Is DoD doing a good job with
we
what
wrote all this law
out?
A few years ago. What's happened?
Exactly.
And so that was your job then, to go in, take a look, and make an assessment.
Exactly.
Okay, so for our listeners who aren't super familiar with the topic, tell us what a modular open systems approach is.
Yeah, so it does get technical quickly, but I'm going to try to keep it high level here. A modular open systems approach is a set of both business and technical strategies to acquiring systems that you can easily swap parts in and out. And I want to emphasize the name is Modular Open Systems, and it's important to focus both on the modular part, meaning that things can be independently swapped in and out, and the open, meaning that they're standard connections. And I'm going to use an analogy here because I just bought a refrigerator.
Okay.
So thinking about my kitchen there, I was able to switch out the refrigerator without affecting the stove or the microwave. So that's modular there. And when I went shopping for my refrigerator, I was able to look at any brand because they were all going to use the same wall socket to plug in. So that's an example of an open standard because each company is using that same standard to give consumers some choice there.
To push this analogy for a second, but on the other hand, when you change out the water filter in your refrigerator, is that an open standard?
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up a really good point, which is that not everything needs to be open in a modular open system. If every single thing were modular and open, that would be impractical. What the law asks DoD to focus on is those key components and interfaces that they expect are going to be upgradable over the life. So I didn't expect the water filter technology is going to change too much while I have my refrigerator. So I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about whether I could swap out that water filter.
So what are the overall benefits then that people say we get from MOSA? Why is it the stock answer, how to fix acquisition?
Yeah, so MOSA does have a lot of potential benefits, and I think really it's intended to both save money and drive innovation. And in this current age where we're really focused on that pacing threat with our adversaries, that's why MOSA comes up a lot. And so some of those benefits, thinking of being able to replace components, is you can do technology refresh more quickly. So you might be able to swap out, for example, a radio that there's better technology available. You can also, thinking about innovation, you might have designed a system and some innovative component didn't even exist when you designed it, but you now need it to respond to an emerging threat. So you're able to do that. It can also help with interoperability. So because systems are using the same components, they're better able to talk to each other on the battlefield. And then cost savings, as you mentioned in your introduction, is a part of it. It's not as proven out yet, but there are a couple ideas there. One is that you can reduce design costs because systems can reuse the same components. And then the second is that you can compete sustainment contracts, which are a big part. Our work has found almost 70% of costs over the life cycle are sustainment. So being able to compete those because you're using open standards that multiple contractors are able to work with, that can help drive cost savings into the sustainment process.
And this isn't all completely new, right? If I think about let's say, the tires on an aircraft or on a ground vehicle, those are kind of already living up to this MOSA promise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And MOSA it's commonly used across commercial companies, and even at DoD, it's not new. We found when we looked at the history that back to 1994, DoD has been putting out memos and directives saying that programs need to use modular open systems approaches. So the legislative emphasis is newer, but the concept is definitely not new.
And does it apply to both hardware and software systems?
Yeah, we mainly focused on hardware, but the MOSA principles do apply to software, hardware, or systems that are a combination. And where we looked at major defense acquisition programs, and I think we all think of those as hardware, but in reality, they're all very software enabled. So the programs we looked at really need to focus on both hardware and software when they design their MOSAs.
Does it have to be done for new systems? So does a system have to be born MOSA? Or can you kind of retrofit the idea of MOSA until you're 50-year-old B-52 or something like that?
Yeah, and that's a really important question because a lot of systems that have a long life cycle at DoD. It's definitely, from what we learned, it's definitely easier for a system to be born MOSA, but that doesn't mean that you can't retrofit a legacy system. And one of the examples I want to highlight here that we saw do that was the Air Force's stand-in attack weapon, where they were modifying a Navy missile that didn't have MOSA. And the program actually originally proposed that they would not put in a MOSA, and Air Force leadership kind of sent them back to the drawing board and said, yes, it's going to cost more. Yes, it might take longer, but we really think it's important that we be able to easily upgrade this munition later on. So they did end up using a MOSA there.
And some of the components within the munition then became more interchangeable.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So it sounds great. Stock answer, how to fix. What are the downsides, if any?
Yeah. So, MOSA definitely changes the business model that DoD has been operating with. So for contractors that were used to building proprietary systems and then having those sustainment contracts, it introduces new ways of thinking about how to do business with DoD. It brings non-traditional vendors potentially into the marketplace because they're able to provide components for weapon systems, but it does require a rethink of that business model. And also for DoD, I don't know if I'd call it a downside, but a challenge is that the benefits of MOSA are in the longer term. We talked about sustainment, that's many years out. So in an environment where people are judged on what can you do for me today, it can be a challenge for program managers and even the chain above them to support the fact that it might cost a little more or take longer to do MOSA now.
One of the things that you and I thought about on the Hill was who actually gets to do that sustainment of systems. And there was a lot of discussion about whether these should be people at government depots or logistics centers, or should it be people on the industry side who have won those contracts? Does a MOSA tilt the balance one way or the other on that kind of question?
That's an interesting question. I think what it does is give the government more flexibility because traditionally, or with a MOSA, you're either going to use an open standard that would be available to multiple contractors or to the government, or the government might decide to purchase the intellectual property for some of those interfaces. So then it lets them make a decision further down the road about who's going to do that sustainment.
So, you touch on this, I can save you some money, but it'll be in the future issue, which is always tough for the government to deal with. The other issue is who's in charge. So who actually owns the responsibility for implementing this kind of approach, a MOSA approach, on a program?
Yeah, and the law really puts the ownership on the program manager because it says programs should implement a MOSA to the maximum extent practicable. We saw a range of the program really taking ownership to the request for proposal, talking more about the contractor would develop the MOSA. So I think it does vary by program, but it comes back to the program manager. And the program manager, though, really needs then a supportive ecosystem within DoD to make sure that they have the resources and the expertise they need to do that.
So with that framing, then you get into this job. Tell us about, GAO always has this really fascinating methodologies. Tell us about the methodology.
Yeah, so, as your listeners probably know, GAO takes a little longer to issue our reports, but it's because we really want to get out there, survey the whole landscape, and understand what's going on. So in this case, the law, as I mentioned, talked about what the programs need to do. It also had a lot of guidance and regulations and things that the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the military departments needed to do. So we did take a broad look at, from a policy guidance and regulation standpoint, from a resourcing standpoint, at those headquarters levels. But then I think really the heart of this work is we did a look at 20 programs across the military departments, and those were major defense acquisition programs or middle tier of acquisition programs. And everybody says they're doing a MOSA, but we really wanted to get in there and understand exactly what the programs were doing and what their planning and their process was like. So
you looked at the traditional MDAP acquisition programs as well as the newer fangled, faster middle tiers.
Yes.
And did some comparisons.
Yes. And the original 2016 NDAA focused on those MDAPs, but then the NDAA for 2021 added a requirement for all acquisition programs to focus on MOSA. So we looked at MDAPs that had started since the law went into place, and then we picked actually the two most recent MTA programs because that requirement was newer. So we tried to really get into all the documentation and data that those programs had. But just as importantly, we went out and we interviewed the programs. We talked to program managers, systems engineers. We talked to the program executive officers and the folks in the military departments who are responsible for supporting those programs to really get behind, the documents and the data will tell you one level, but then to really understand what might be the challenges. You need that human perspective.
So I understand the documents. What's the data?
So the data is more about what the programs report on what they're doing on MOSA. And that's, and maybe data is a loose term here, but more what people are reporting up, because the laws did require some reporting and things like selected acquisition reports, certifications that programs were doing MOSA. So we tried to look at what might be being reported up in an aggregate sense too.
Did you talk to industry as well, the actual prime contractors or subcontractors or people like that?
Yeah, so we always do want to get a broad range of perspectives here. And in MOSA, we realized pretty quickly that industry was going to be important. So we did reach out through industry associations. We actually found people pretty reluctant to talk to us on this one. But what we did is, to make sure that we got at least as much of that perspective as we could, we looked at the industry white papers that are out there. Industry had commented on some of the regulations related to MOSA, so we reviewed comments there. And then we also went to a number of conferences where industry was speaking. But just a plug for your listeners, GAO is always interested in perspectives. When we do talk to people, we really want to get that broad perspective. So we're not interested in naming this company said this, that company said that. So I do encourage people to reach out to GAO.
So with that methodology, that set of data, the set of interviews, what did you find?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the numbers because that's what everyone wants to know, but I think it's potentially the least meaningful part of it. So we saw that 14 out of the 20 programs we looked at said that they were doing a MOSA, but that can mean a lot of different things because, as you know, the law is pretty flexible. It says do a MOSA to the maximum extent practicable. And so doing a MOSA can mean, that you focused on modularity, that you focused on openness. So that number is a starting point to see where people are, but then we really dug into what they were doing, and we saw some challenges there on early planning for MOSA. Some of those documents that we looked at, the law was pretty specific on what needed to be in there. We found it wasn't in there. And then we also found some gaps in coordination and resourcing at the military departments that were holding programs back from implementing their MOSA to the full extent.
I know it's not typical. People don't read GAO reports to see who got an A, but some programs are doing well, some programs are not doing well. Who's doing well?
Yeah, and it's a little early. We talked about the benefits being long-term, so it's a little early to say a specific program is doing well or not doing well, but I think we had two examples that I want to highlight from our report. We did see a lot of support at the Army in particular for MOSA. So all of the Army programs we looked at were doing a MOSA in comparison to half or a little more than half at the other military departments. And
that means they have documentation to show that they're interested. And then do they also have documentation in the form of contracts that show that they're actually following up on that interest?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we highlight in our report, is that there are some real gaps on in terms of what's in the documentation. I mean, we did find where programs said that they were doing a MOSA that they usually had it sort of written down in some way or another, but when we as far as what is in the actual documents, it wasn't always as much as you might want. But you could that's where I think those interviews really came in too, and understanding what exactly a program was doing. And so, for example, at the Army, I'll use the PEO for aviation as an example. That was something where they had stood up a MOSA coordination board across their programs. We could really see that flowing through to the contracts. And that was, as we talked to their leadership team, that was driven by the PEO seeing MOSA as a way to improve the affordability of the portfolio. So, even they're too soon to tell, but it was something that stood out to us. And then another example that we saw was the Air Force on its munition programs was driving programs to use a common standard, their weapons open standard there. And that was helping improve the standardization of munition programs. We actually saw it starting to flow into the other military departments as well. And I think both of those examples highlight the importance of leadership commitment that we saw, that it really does take somebody from the top being supportive of MOSA to help programs actually leverage a MOSA in their programs.
So some people are doing well, but unsaid, probably most are not doing well, despite the congressional mandate and the sort of common sense, well, this must be good. So what's your sense of why this is so hard to do?
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, this has been around, like the department started telling them in the 90s to do this. And that was something we really wanted to focus on in our report, because we didn't want to be writing the same report in 10 years. So I think the reasons that it's hard, we talked before about the short-term nature, right? Prove to me your business case for doing that. And that can be hard to do in an environment where we do want to get capabilities out quickly. But it takes resources, and we saw gaps in the department's resourcing. The law actually requires the secretaries of the military departments to provide adequate resourcing and expertise, and that's critical to keeping MOSA running. And we saw that despite that law being on the books for a while, the departments told us that they hadn't actually assessed what they needed. And so we saw challenges with expertise and with the digital tools that you need, like model-based systems engineering software, and with the basic funding that programs needed. We did hear programs tell us that they wanted to use a MOSA, but then it just ended up on the chopping block with their program budget.
Because using a MOSA necessarily costs more upfront.
Well, and I'm glad you asked that question, because we also found that programs would tell us that they assumed it cost more upfront. And then we said, what kind of analysis did you do to show that? Particularly if they decided they weren't going to do a MOSA, what kind of analysis was there? And we actually found that none of the programs we looked at had done a formal analysis of the cost.
Is there a guidebook on how to do an analysis?
There is not. And that's one of the things that we recommended, that OSD really focus on, because it is important to make those business case for MOSA.
And then if you, how do you know when it's done, right? What are the metrics of achievement of MOSA, especially when you're talking about this long time frame?
Yeah, and that's a challenge, and it's something that we didn't really look into because programs were so early on. But that's where I think having, the early planning, putting things in the documents helps both the government and industry to know what is the government looking at, what is going to be the marker, even in our request for proposal, what's the marker that the government's looking for. So I think, what exactly the right metrics are is probably another GAO study down the road, but getting those documented early helps to provide that roadmap.
And I'm guessing it's going to be things along the lines of, could you swap out subsystems? Could you change contractors?
Yeah.
Right? Could you keep up with technology?
And we did see some programs were really doing that verification early on. They were basically having, days where they'd have industry come in and show that you could do that. But this was our first full-blown review in a while of MOSA, but actually the year before in our annual weapon systems assessment, we did a drill down on MOSA there. And one of the things we found there is programs didn't have a plan to verify the MOSA. So potentially, we talked about there might be costs. So potentially you might be paying more for a MOSA, or you might be expecting benefits that then you're not testing for. So you don't really know if you're going to get those benefits. So that was something that we recommended actually back in that 2023 annual weapon systems assessment.
And one of the things I think I saw in the report is that one of the benefits of MOSA is this cost savings, but it really is not just cost savings to the program implementing the MOSA. It really works best when multiple programs are implementing multiple approaches, and then together the DoD customer is making use of all of that potential flexibility, interoperability, interchangeability. But it seems like there's a little bit of a policy barrier there.
Yeah, and that's something that we talk about in the report, is that looking at things across the portfolio is really important, because it might be that your savings really comes from reusing the same radio in multiple platforms, but the way that the DoD acquisition system is focused, it's really on a program by program case. That's how the legislation is written. And when we went at the next level from our programs and talked to the systems engineers for the program executive officers, we found only 2 of them had an actual process for coordinating MOSA across programs. So that was another thing that we recommended, because we really did see the benefits of coordinating across the portfolio, but it's not something that DoD is necessarily set up to do organically.
Yeah, and the management structure doesn't work that way. The acquisition contracting process doesn't work that way. The budgeting process doesn't work that way as well. We budget by program. We don't give programs the benefit of, you're going to save money in the future, therefore you deserve some more money up front. It's almost a punishment. It's the opposite. There's a bunch of reforms underway, or at least being considered right now, including some that came out of the Budget Commission report. And some have been laid in by the appropriators over the last couple of years, moving towards this more portfolio style approach. That portfolio style approach to budgeting actually could better take advantage of MOSA. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's not something that we looked at specifically, in part because that commission was ongoing with the budget, so we didn't want to step on what they were doing. But I think overall that our work on the benefits of portfolio shows that that's probably the case. And we also recommended that the military departments look at how they're resourcing MOSA. So I think that that's definitely something that they could consider in there as well.
And then just to get into it for a second, if you're a development program running an acquisition effort, which is either a middle tier fast effort or a traditional MDAP long-term effort, you've got a certain kind of money. Is the MOSA work the same kind of money, or we're talking about basic research to do your MOSA work, or is it really kind of indistinguishable from the kind of money a program typically gets?
Yeah, that wasn't a challenge that actually came up from any other programs. It was more about having enough money, not the right kind of money.
Right, right. So the funding's always an issue, and especially upfront funding. But what about the direction side of this, the management side of this? Was there clear direction being given? Did the people in the trenches feel like they were receiving clear direction to go after these kinds of things?
Yeah, so I think that is an interesting question because at the very highest levels, there is pretty clear direction. I mean, the law provided clear direction. There was a 2019 memo that the service secretary signed out that said MOSA is a warfighting imperative. The 2022 National Defense Strategy called for MOSA. But then when it filtered down, I think it was really a mix. What we saw is it really came down to having a specific champion for MOSA in the chain of command. Like I mentioned before, the Air Force example, where that program was told to kind of go back to the drawing board, or the Army setting up a portfolio coordination board. That's the kind of leadership that we saw, where other programs, we saw that they weren't getting that direction, and it was harder for them to make the business case. And that's where we saw programs saying, this was something we thought about, but ultimately we just couldn't make it work.
And that's the leadership also taking a long view and saying, spend some money up front, even though it's not going to be me, it's going to be someone sitting at this desk, 2 people after me,
right,
that are going to really recoup our early investments. Okay. So the report comes out, you comment on the couple of programs doing well, most not, funding issues, management issues, despite all this promise. When you put out a report like this, you give the department a chance to react. How did the Department of Defense react to your looking at their MOSA activities?
Yeah, so we actually got really positive reaction here. We had 14 recommendations, which is a lot. I think the most I've made in 20 years, but the department fully concurred with all of those recommendations. We've actually seen them already moving out on some. OSD came out with a MOSA guidebook that was kind of long awaited, that issued in February. We highlighted some challenges with the
February of this year.
February of this year,
okay.
Yeah. We highlighted some challenges with the Navy's guidance, and the Navy has a MOSA guidebook out now. And actually, even while our report is over for comment, there was another memo that came out from the service secretary saying, we have to do this. MOSA is really important. We need to get guidance, fully aligned with the laws, which was a challenge we highlighted. So I think there's some really good momentum right now towards MOSA.
Is there a way to estimate, if I gave you a program and I said, my boss wants me to do MOSA, is there a way for me to estimate the cost?
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line, what we found is no, there's not. We saw some examples of where people tried to look at how to do that. For example, I might have cost avoidance because I could upgrade a single component instead of having to upgrade the whole system. But that's why we recommended that methodology, because there's really not a good tool right now that people can use to do that.
Okay. And simultaneously, the Department of Defense is putting out guidance, like you said, Navy and OSD. You're seeing activity in the Air Force and Army. What's happening on the Hill side, right? I think some people in Congress are thinking about this also.
Yeah, and we didn't see a lot of legislative activity while we were doing the work, I think because Congress understood that there had been a lot of legislative activity. But, I know there's the Forged Act out now, and that was released after our work. So we didn't specifically look at it, but it does, the principles kind of align with MOSA in terms of innovation, increasing competition. So that doesn't specifically address MOSA. One thing, though, that it does do, it repeals a lot of different provisions. But one of those does touch on MOSA, which is on the requirement for MOSA in planning documents. And there could be many ways to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be what's currently in the law, but we did find that early planning was really important for MOSA, as I mentioned before, to give industry and government a sense of what the government wants. So that's something, that we emphasized in our report that's touched on in the Forged Act.
In this drive for DoD to embrace the use of more commercial systems and services and make use of commercial contractors and move them over to the defense side so that they're doing both, tapping into their commercial innovation, tapping into their private sector, private capital funding sources. Does all of that drive, if DoD does a better job of going commercial, does that naturally mean they will be more using MOSA efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's likely as you bring in more contractors, more non-traditional contractors into the defense ecosystem, because you can bring in smaller vendors that make one component that you're going to plug and play into the system rather than designing the whole system. So I think that it would drive towards that, because if you're using commercial things, they're more likely to be developed using open standards.
And does MOSA necessarily end the need for systems integrators?
No, I think MOSA is a really wide range of things. So I wouldn't say it ends that need. I mean, we didn't go into that specifically, but where it can be a part of a system that's modular or open, or the whole system, that could necessarily work with a number of different business models.
Right. You're still the integrator of your kitchen.
Exactly.
Someone still has to be sort of buying the piece, making sure it fits in, and making sure it's interoperable with all the other pieces in your kitchen.
Right. It does still have to work together in the end, even though it's designed that way and it's easier to facilitate. Somebody does still need to be making sure it works together as a system.
If NDI members want to see this report, where can they find it?
Sure. It's available on GAO's website. They can search. I've Googled a lot myself, just GAO MOSA, and it will come up.
And we'll drop a link to it in the text box under the video. In general, if members want to take you up on your offer and give you information, offer themselves up for interviews, even give you data, how would the typical process be by which they could find you? How would they even know what you're working on?
Typically, a GAO report has a director's information on there. And so if, we don't always publicly announce our work, so it's a little bit sometimes, I think, challenging to know what we are working on. But if industry gets word that we're working on a study, then they can reach out to the director of a relevant report, or our Office of Public Affairs contact is on there too, both on our website and on all our reports. So that's always a good starting point to reach out to GAO.
And if you get better data, more perspectives, it's good for everyone. Potentially the reports are more informed, and the recommendations are much more crisp. And hopefully
Exactly.
someone follows up on them. So, we encourage the membership to view GAO as a potential ally. And you certainly don't want them to go off on a wild goose chase when you are sitting on good information about a program. So Ann McDonough is with the Government Accountability Office, an expert on MOSA and many things. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you for having me today.
And thanks everyone for joining Emerging Tech Horizons. Please visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various upcoming webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series, and we'll be doing a Tech 101 on MOSA coming up soon. I want to preview August 27th through 29th is the third NDIA Emerging Technologies Conference, going to be held at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. We're hard at work with our industry partners as well as our government partners to put together a program that looks at emerging technologies, how best to establish industry-government partnerships to better transition them into quicker production and operational use. So please visit our website. We'll be posting information about that all the time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to like our episodes and and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into Emerging Tech Horizons.